Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about the Siege of Malta during the Second World War and a little bit about the situation in the Mediterranean at the time. During the Second World War, British control of the Mediterranean was centered on Gibraltar in the west, Malta in the center, and Alexandria in the east, which acted as the Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet's primary base of operations. Malta is a small island that was 10 sailing days from Britain. It had one airstrip at Halfar, originally serving as a Royal Naval Air Station, but was then put under Royal Air Force control. The Italians themselves had 11 airfields on the island of Sicily, the closest of which, Camiso, was a mere 65 nautical miles from Malta. During the Second World War, it was in the best possible position to intercept Axis shipping in the Mediterranean, especially when combined with relatively long-range bombers. In the first 6 months after the Battle of Crete, over 280,000 tons of cargo were sunk en route to Erwin Rommel's forces by aircraft and submarines operating from Malta. Combined with Rommel's lack of logistical considerations when conducting operations, this spelled disaster for Germany's Africa Corps. In addition, it was a reconnaissance flight from Malta on November 1940 that confirmed that the Italian battleships were in Taranto harbor, allowing Andrew Cunningham, Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet, to raid the base and disable half of the Italian fleet stationed there. With a forward operating base of such strategic importance, it's difficult to imagine why Malta was left so poorly defended in the early parts of the war, but it wasn't without reason. In the interwar years, Britain was allied with the only two major Mediterranean powers, France and Italy. When war broke, France had the fourth largest navy in the world and was second in Europe only behind the British. And since the French also had, on paper, the most powerful army in the world, the idea that they would fall to Axis control was practically unthinkable. However, as we know, France did fall and Mussolini did eventually declare war on Britain and France, and immediately Malta was under siege. The Italians had plans to both attack the islands and seize them, but the latter never came into fruition and was deemed as impractical as the island's defenses grew. They then chose to simply bombard the island into submission. The first bombing raid took place on June 11, 1940, when a force of 93 SM-79s and 18 C-200 fighters bombed the island. It would be the heaviest day of bombing for months, with 43,000 kilograms of bombs being dropped. They attacked Halfar Airfield, the seaplane tender base at Calafrana, and the dockyards around Valletta. However, despite some 250-kilogram bombs hitting Halfar, it wasn't enough to do serious damage and the airfield was quickly operational again. No damage was done to Malta's naval facilities, and keep in mind that the British force on the island only consisted of 6 Gloster Sea Gladiator biplanes that had been assembled the previous month. Nonetheless, the Italians still had the upper hand. That is, until late June when 5 Hawker Hurricanes arrived on the island. Another force of 12 Hurricanes would arrive later that August from HMS Argus, the first of about 719 aircraft flown from aircraft carriers to successfully make it to the island. In late October of 1940, Italy invaded Greece at Hitler's behest, and things changed rapidly. At first, many of the Sicilian-based air units were transferred to support the offensive, giving Malta some breathing room. Now, until this happened, Hitler didn't really want to be involved in a Mediterranean war. His primary focus at the time had been the Soviet Union. At most, there were plans to seize Gibraltar, but that was the extent of it. When the British came to Greece's aid in April of the next year, Hitler felt like his hands were tied. His interest in the Mediterranean skyrocketed mostly because he wanted to protect the Romanian oil fields from RAF bombing, and to also rescue Mussolini from embarrassment. As a result, the Luftwaffe arrived in the Mediterranean on January 10, 1941, and its effects were immediate. The 10th Flieger Corps, or Air Corps, consisted of a versatile mix of aircraft, ranging from the single-engine Bf-109E7 and Ju-87R to the twin-engine Bf-110D and Junkers Ju-88A4. On this day, Operation Excess was also conducted, where a Royal Navy convoy reinforced Malta, Alexandria, and Greece. The Luftwaffe were much more effective than their Italian counterparts. Italy was incapable of crippling British air naval assets in the tiny island. This could, in part, be attributed to the Regia Aeronautica's insistence on bombing at high altitudes. It is estimated that a mere half of all bombs dropped from 15,000 feet in ideal weather conditions during daylight hours would land within 800 feet of its intended target. The circular error probable could increase to 1,300 feet with even worse weather conditions. In addition, the 100-kilogram bombs typically used by the Italians were unable to effectively disable airfields. By contrast, the Germans at the Battle of Britain typically employed 250 and 500-kilogram bombs. A typical attack from the Luftwaffe saw Ju-88s fly in at around 20,000 feet, flanked by two groups of Bf-109s. Another group of 109s flew in at 30,000 feet in order to have the energy to pounce on any British interceptors. The first group of Ju-88s and their close 109 escorts then dropped to around 15,000 feet and released their bombs. The British forces on the island were being held in a chokehold. Things would soon look better for the British. By October 1941, Flieger Corps 10's effectiveness was degrading quite significantly. The Air Corps was starved of aircraft as the Russian front expanded. Their total strength varied between 400 and 450 aircraft, of which 250 were serviceable at any given time, a figure that included only 30 Bf-109s. By contrast, the Royal Air Force had 846 aircraft with substantial repair and maintenance facilities set up in the entire Middle East. In June, the Luftwaffe was transferred to other theaters, leaving the Italians, once again, to be the only air force in Sicily. Just previously, more Hurricanes from RAF No. 249 Squadron and 126 Squadron arrived in Malta. At this point, the Italians only had 63 operational aircraft, of which only 14 were bombers. The advantage, as you can imagine, switched to the British again. In July, the island welcomed its first major resupply convoy since January, Operation Substance, followed by Operation Halberd in September. Almost 40 merchant ships arrived to Malta. With the absence of the Luftwaffe, the island became a flourishing naval base again. Between June and the end of September, British submarines sank 49 ships, totaling 150,000 tons of cargo to North Africa. By November, this had become a crisis for Rommel, as 68% of the supplies shipped from Italy to Africa failed to arrive. This was exemplified on November 9th when Force K annihilated the Druisburg convoy of 7 ships and 2 of its destroyer escorts. This killing spree would only last until the Germans saw the pressing need to reinforce the Italians. They sent Luftflotte 2, consisting mostly of the 2nd Flieger Corps, but also some elements of the previous 10th Flieger Corps. At this point, Hitler also assigned General Field Marshal Albert Kesselring as Commander-in-Chief South, signifying that the Germans now treated the Mediterranean as a formal theater of German operations. With this new strength, the Luftwaffe began raiding Malta more intensely. During the month of April 1942, an average of 2 heavy raids were flown a day against the island, typically consisting of between 30 to 70 bombers with their fighter escorts. Malta, once again, was being strangled. As a result, the Royal Navy and US Navy launched Operation Bowery, where 46 Spitfires arrived on the island from the carriers HMS Eagle and USS Wasp. Even with these reinforcements, Kesselring declared air superiority over the island in May, and Luftflotte 2 began to be redeployed away from Sicily. A token force of 27 Bf-109Fs and 21 Ju-88s were left, along with several reconnaissance aircraft. In August, the Royal Navy launched Operation Pedestal, the most heavily defended convoy ever put together by the Allies. Malta at this point was on the brink, being blockaded and starved by German and Italian forces. The Royal Navy managed to deliver over 50,000 metric tons of supplies, but paid dearly with 1 aircraft carrier, 2 cruisers, and a destroyer. Simultaneously, HMS Furious successfully ferried over 30 Spitfires to the island as part of Operation Bellows. Although a tactical defeat on the part of the British, as only 5 of the 14 ships made it to the island, it was a strategic victory. During the rest of August, 35% of the Axis convoy shipping to North Africa was lost. This proved to be too much for Rommel. After his defeats at the Second Battle of El Alamein and the Allied landings under Operation Torch in November 1942, the war in North Africa was essentially over. The Luftwaffe and Italian Air Force relocated their remaining units from Sicily, and the siege of Malta had ended. There are plenty of reasons why the Axis were unable to suppress the British forces at Malta for long periods of time. Hitler never really had a strategic goal for the island. Like the Battle of Britain, their plans were reactionary. He was always more preoccupied with other fronts, particularly in Eastern Europe. And you can't entirely blame the Germans for this. After the evacuation from Dunkirk, Britain could not effectively strike Germany in isolation from Alexandria or from the British mainland, not for the foreseeable future. Hitler intended to return to the destruction of Britain after a planned, short, and successful campaign against the Soviets. As we all know, the Eastern Front was anything but short and successful. It wasn't until Fliegerkorps II made its debut in late 1941 where the Germans showed some kind of true commitment to the region. By then it was far too late. The Luftwaffe only arrived in Sicily with 325 aircraft, of which only 229 were serviceable. In contrast, the Royal Air Force had about 700 aircraft at Malta, more than had been available at the beginning of the Battle of Britain. In fact, Hitler had only agreed to the Italian-led plan to invade Malta, Operation Hercules, in late April of 1942, only to be cancelled in late June. In part because of this indecision, the Allies won. Although debated, the contribution that the forces on Malta made to the victory in North Africa is generally considered to be a success. Aircraft from the island proved to be a massive pain to access supply convoys trying to reach the continent. Most of the aircraft operating from the island had sufficient range to attack any convoy that traveled west of Sicily. The ferry Swordfish, for example, one of the shortest range aircraft stationed on the island, had a combat radius of 183 nautical miles when carrying a 680 kilogram torpedo. Both the Wellington Mark I and Blenheim Mark IV, carrying a 1,000-pound bomb load, had a combat radius of 782 and 500 nautical miles respectively, enough to attack any Axis convoy in the Mediterranean, even if it hugged the coast of Greece. In fact, the Wellington could reach beyond Tobruk and back, while the Blenheim could almost reach the city. So, that was the Siege of Malta, along with gameplay from War Thunder in the background. I think that the first mission shown here was actually of Operation Bowery, though I didn't see USS Wasp, so I'm suspicious about that. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video essay, and perhaps I'll do more things like it in the future. Who knows? Alright, bye everyone.